I'm Andrea Gallo. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a reporter for The Advocate and the Times-Picayune. We wanted to start today's press club with a moment of silence in honor of former Governor Edwin Edwards. So if everybody could just take a moment. Thank you. Our speaker today is Chip Kline, who is the Director of Coastal Activities for the state and the chairman of CPRA. And a little bit of background on him. He has served as the chairman of the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority and been the Director of Coastal Activities for the state since 2018. Chip oversees policy initiatives related to Louisiana's coastal program and manages the day-to-day operations of the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. He is responsible for integrating the functions of all state agencies as they relate to coastal protection, and he has been integral in advancing objectives of the state's coastal master plan in Louisiana and Washington, D.C. Just a reminder that he will take questions after he finishes speaking, but those are limited to media and members of the press club. Thank you all so much, and join me in welcoming Chip.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, and I too would like to begin by expressing my condolences to the family and loved ones of former Governor Edwin Edwards, and just offer my thoughts and prayers to all those who knew and loved him who are currently mourning his loss. 6 years ago, I spoke to this very group, and I delivered a very simple message. The state of Louisiana needed to prioritize hurricane protection and coastal restoration. Today, I stand before you as the leader of the state's coastal program with a much different message. As a result of this state prioritizing this issue, we now have the necessary resources, the funding, and the political will, and the strong scientific foundation that will allow this state to actually build the large-scale hurricane protection and coastal restoration projects that have literally been envisioned for years, and to pursue new policy initiatives to help sustain South Louisiana for generations to come. So my message today is simple. We are at a turning point for Louisiana's coast. No statistic speaks stronger to that fact than the fact that Governor Edwards, during his second inaugural address, said that over the next 4 years, we will break ground on projects that will ultimately build more land in the state of Louisiana than we expect to lose. That is the first time that we have ever been able to say that since the 1930s. And it is the result of the hard work of the over 180 men and women who work at the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. As state agencies go, we are a young agency. We were formed after Hurricane Katrina and Rita, the storms of 2005. We are the single state entity with the authority to articulate a clear statement of priorities for the sustainability, protection, and restoration of South Louisiana. We have one single mandate: to develop, implement, and oversee a coastal master plan, a 50-year, $50 billion plan that identifies all of the projects that are needed to achieve a sustainable coast for South Louisiana. We start every presentation we do with this slide. It is our reminder as to what has happened to our coast, and it reminds us of what we stand to lose if we do not implement a single coastal restoration or hurricane protection project. It also serves as our motivation to continue the fight to restore and protect our coast. Over the last several years, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority has secured over $21 billion for restoration and protection projects in all 20 coastal parishes. We have completed 13 barrier island projects, 28 shoreline protection projects, 25 marsh creation projects, and 22 hurricane protection projects, with 12 hydrologic restoration projects as well. These investments have resulted over 330 miles of improved levees and flood walls. 330 miles, approximately the distance between Houston, Texas to New Orleans, Louisiana. Just think about that for a second. 300 miles of levees that are protecting people, businesses, and livelihoods. We're also in the process of constructing massive floodgates. These floodgates and protection measures are not just protecting hundreds of people. They're protecting tens of thousands of people that live across South Louisiana. This is a depiction to show you the scope and scale of the Bayou Chene floodgate that is currently under construction. Many of you are very familiar with during high water times throughout the year, we've had to sink the barge on Bayou Chene to prevent the backwater flooding in St. Mary, St. Martin, Iberville, Assumption, Terrebonne, and Lafourche parishes. This floodgate will be finished construction sometime in late September, early October this year. So next year, when the Mississippi River and the Atchafalaya Rivers water levels are elevated, we can close this structure with a push of a button that again protects six parishes within that particular region. We're also, you'll be seeing some groundbreaking and some ribbon cuttings over the next several months with Governor Edwards. These investments are not only protecting tens of thousands of people, these investments are also paying off. In 2005, when Hurricane Rita was coming on shore, Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes experienced 8 to 9 feet of storm surge. 12,000 homes flooded. In 2019, Hurricane Barry was coming on shore. Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes experienced 8 to 9 feet of storm surge. 11 homes flooded. That is proof that these investments are paying off. Over the last several years, we've also invested hundreds of millions of dollars in restoring our first line of defense in coastal Louisiana, our barrier islands. This is a picture you can see. East Trinity on the left-hand side of your screen had deteriorated to a very small barrier island. As a result of the BP oil spill funding, you can see the picture on the right. This project will currently be completed this year, probably in the next few weeks. It is part of the Terrebonne Basin Barrier Island and Beach Nourishment Project, which has two other increments, Timberlair Island and West Bell Headland. When all is said and done, over 1,100 acres of beach, dune, and coastal habitat will be created in these three projects. You can see these investments in the barrier islands of Shell Island, Pelican Island, and Schofield back in 2006. As a result of our investment, this is what these islands look like today in 2020. We're also constructing projects that are creating a great deal of coastal habitat for our migratory birds, specifically the state's bird, the brown pelican. Queen Bess Island is one of the largest pelican rookeries in the state of Louisiana. You can see back in 2018, the island itself had deteriorated to about 5 acres. After the restoration completed in 2020, we now have over 30 acres of marsh and a migratory bird habitat that is just adjacent to Grand Isle. I think this project also symbolizes just how far the state has come since the BP oil spill. As I mentioned, this is one of the largest pelican rookeries in the state of Louisiana. Right after nesting season, we had the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries who went out to this island. They were able to discover several brown pelicans that had purple bands on their legs. Those purple bands mean that they were heavily oiled during the BP oil spill. They were brought back into the lab, renourished back to health, and then released back into the wild. And to have those brown pelicans back on this migratory bird habitat, I think symbolizes just how far the state of Louisiana has come since the BP oil spill. You can see the bottom picture there. Thousands of brown pelicans are now nesting on Queen Bess Island. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what rebuilding coastal Louisiana looks like. Since 2017, 157 million cubic yards of fill has been utilized to create close to 50,000 acres of land. This is dredging activity on East Trinity Island. Activity like this is happening all over South Louisiana this year. 157 million cubic yards of material is enough to fill the Superdome 34 times. So 34 times of utilizing the material that's been dredged since probably 2007. And this year alone, we have 3 projects that will utilize enough material to fill the Superdome 18 times. Just to go to show you the progress and the amount of projects and the scope and scale of those projects that we have implemented, will be implementing this year across South Louisiana. It's important to know, ladies and gentlemen, that these investments are not just in Southeast Louisiana. These are from Cameron, Calcasieu, Vermilion, through South Central and Vermilion, Iberia, all the way into Southeast Louisiana, Plaquemines and St. Bernard parishes. So let's talk about coastal resilience. It's not just about protection, it's not just about restoration. It's about having a coast that is resilient. As you've just seen, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority has made huge strides in addressing land loss up to this point in time. But we are coming into a major turning point for the state's coastal program. When the master plan was first envisioned, it faced head-on the fact that the coastal land loss problem was too large for just random acts of restoration, meaning a couple hundred acres here, a couple hundred acres there. We knew that projects that matched the scale of the problem would be required if we wanted to change the trajectory of a coast that was literally sinking into the Gulf of Mexico. So today, not only do we finally have the resources at our disposal to enact these extremely large projects, we also have the additional information about the challenges that await us in future decades that we must tackle today. And so our overall resilience and the overall sustainability of coastal Louisiana begins and ends with sediment diversions. As I mentioned earlier, nearly all of the benefits that we have seen across South Louisiana today are the result of dredging. Dredging the Mississippi River, dredging the Atchafalaya River, dredging areas offshore and pumping that sediment to create tens of thousands of acres of new land. Sediment diversions have been studied, scrutinized, analyzed, and criticized for years. There's decades of science that point to sediment diversions. What do I mean by sediment diversions? I mean the solution to our land loss crisis is reconnecting the river. Sediment diversions harness the power of the Mississippi River for the long-term sustainability of sediment, water, and nutrient delivery to the surrounding wetlands. Sediment diversions are the best solution to utilize our best weapon in fighting and winning this war on our coast. And so there are 2 sediment diversions that were identified in the 2012 master plan that we are currently moving forward towards implementation. The Mid Barataria sediment diversion on the west bank of Plaquemines Parish and the Mid Breton sediment diversion on the east bank of Plaquemines Parish. So why sediment diversions? Sediment diversions reconnect the river and it reestablishes the natural land building process that literally built the land we stand on today. They are our only sustainable way to build new land. It also sustains the land that's in place today, and they will sustain the land that we're building through some of our dredging projects. And finally, it restores the estuary and the ecosystem's productivity and historical salinity patterns. From a land building standpoint, the Mid Barataria sediment diversion can build over 13,000 acres of land in 50 years. This land building scenario takes into account the most extreme levels of sea level rise that is projected over a 50-year time frame, which is about 1.5 meters, or about 2.7 feet. If we do not see those extreme levels of sea level rise pan out over the next 50 years, that land building capability will almost double, almost 26,000 acres of land. As I mentioned earlier, this is about mimicking the natural process that created the state of Louisiana to begin with. You can see a depiction here on the west bank of Plaquemines Parish. It's located in an area which will capture the maximum amount of sediment that's included in that river. It's about a 2-mile intake channel there within deposits that fresh water and that sediment into the Barataria Basin, which has some of the highest rates of land loss anywhere in coastal Louisiana. As I also mentioned earlier, this is we're relying on decades of science. Every single federal study and state study that has looked at coastal restorations and identified the solutions that we need to implement have called for reconnecting the Mississippi River to our coastal marshes. Even going back to the 1920s, after the flood of 1927, recognized that by leveeing the Mississippi River, that it was going to cut off that sediment supply. In order for us to keep up with land loss, we must reconnect the Mississippi River to the Barataria Basin. And so we know that, excuse me, did I miss a slide? Nope. So maybe you don't trust us. Maybe you don't trust computer models. Maybe you don't trust the studies that have been done over the last several decades. This is a picture that was taken in Vidalia, Louisiana, of a roadway that was flooded by the Mississippi River for several months, that literally had to be cleared off, and now you have 4 to 5 feet of sand dunes on each side of that road. This is a picture of the Bonnie Carey Spillway. We saw repeated openings of the Bonnie Carey Spillway in 2019. There's a tremendous amount of sediment in that spillway now due to those openings. And the federal government, through the United States Army Corps of Engineers, is now taking material that was deposited in that spillway to construct the $760 million West Shore Lake Pontchartrain levee system around St. Charles, St. John, and St. James parishes. To give you kind of the idea, this is about 2 to 3 feet of sediment and sand that is deposited in that spillway. There is more than enough sediment in that river for it to do exactly what we need it to do. And so we know that our estuary is going to continue to change. If we do nothing, our estuary and our ecosystems are going to continue to collapse. So yes, we want to implement change into our ecosystems and our estuaries across South Louisiana. Current marsh in the Barataria Basin without the project is about 335,000 acres today. After 50 years without the project, the projected reduce of wetlands in the area is about 52,000 acres, up to 85% less marsh than what we see today. And so right now, as it relates to the Mid Barataria sediment diversion, we are in the middle of a quite lengthy regulatory process. We just released the draft environmental impact statement, which identifies all of the positive benefits, all of the negative impacts, and then the mitigation strategies to address those negative impacts. There is $300 million set aside to address the negative impacts associated with this project. This project in total is approximately $2 billion to construct. It is being funded by the BP oil spill dollars, by the way, in which the federal government, through the Department of Justice, mandated that this portion of dollars be spent on restoring barrier islands and sediment diversions. So we are following the law, and we are following the consent decree associated with the BP oil spill. So we just went through a robust public comment process, which ended in early June. We are currently analyzing all of those public comments. Over 40,000 comments were submitted for consideration. So we're working through those public comments with the United States Army Corps of Engineers. They are the lead regulatory agency on this project. And we will be back out in the Barataria Basin areas in Plaquemines Parish to finalize the mitigation plans associated with this project before the final EIS is published. So those that are impacted by this project have a full understanding of the mitigation measures that the state will be deploying. So everything that I just talked about is the state of Louisiana reacting to things. We've been operating in a reactionary state of mind here in the state of Louisiana for far too long. Reacting to subsidence, reacting to sea level rise, reacting to how vulnerable we are to hurricanes. So in our conversations with the governor upon his reelection, we advise that it is now time for this state to address the causes of many of these issues, to address the causes of climate change. So as a result of the governor signing an executive order, we now have a climate change initiatives task force in the state of Louisiana. This effort includes 146 experts and stakeholders on the task force and its 10 subcommittees. We've held 37 public meetings and have collected over 170 actions from the public telling us what they would like to see in a Louisiana climate plan. The goal in front of this task force is to reach net carbon or have carbon neutrality, net zero by 2050. Imagine that, an energy producing state trying to receive net zero of carbon emissions by 2050. And we're doing all of this by working with industry, not against it. Industry representatives, oil and gas, energy companies, all have a seat on this task force. And so our approach on this climate work has been much the same as it has been in the coastal program up to this point in time. Number one, it's science-driven. It's going to be bottom-up rather than top-down. We're welcoming all stakeholders to the discussion. It's going to be balanced solutions that are actually implementable, play to our strength and needs, and to do it all in a way that is transparent and open to the public. Related to the Climate Initiatives Task Force, the governor also petitioned the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management to begin the process of looking into the feasibility of have wind energy generated off of our coast. Last month, the process got kicked off with the first intergovernmental meeting with BOEM and was hosted 5 additional days of stakeholder meetings, which we refer to as Wind Week. So this is proof that we can do things that are good for the environment and good for the economy here in South Louisiana. Our third major effort that's focused on policy initiatives is to build out from the work that CPRA and the Coastal Master Plan is doing to include new agencies and new tools in our approach to a more resilient coast. Without losing sight of our responsibility to protect and restore the coast, we need agencies with other specialties tending to the needs of a rapidly changing and vital part of our state. So working with the Department of Economic Development, working with the Workforce Commission and others contemplating economic needs for our future. We need the Children and Family Services and the Department of Health ensuring a vibrant, healthy coast for all residents, and we need to make sure that others are making strides to further strengthen the built environment and sustain the ecosystem. CPRA is also becoming an economic engine of its own. $630 million to $840 million of expenditures every year results in about $460 to $620 million in wages every year. $1.1 to $1.5 billion in annual output. Close to 10,000 jobs each year, with average wages of about $60,000 per year. And so my message to you today, again, is that we are at a turning point for Louisiana's coast. We can't have the coast that we had 30 to 40 years ago. We've been very transparent with the public about that fact. But we can have the coast that we need to have. A coast that can sustain over 800 square miles of land. A coast that can protect the overwhelming majority of our citizens. A coast that is able to preserve our cultural heritage and allows our economy and the working coast to thrive into the future. So sometimes we get asked by members of the public and sometimes even members of the media, is this even worth it? Why are we doing this? And simply put, it's because this place matters. This place is our home. And this issue, the issue of saving the state we love, is an issue for the ages. And so I thank you for allowing me to be here with you today, and I will be happy to take any questions that you may have. Okay, I guess I'll go. Yes, sir.
I've been fishing down right where you put the diversion canal for about 11 years at least. And it's my understanding we've spent maybe $100 million on this project so far, is that right? And it's not permitted yet.
Yes, that is correct. So overall, the project cost is about $2 billion. So this is a large-scale infrastructure project with a hefty price tag. But in order for us to get to a permit, we have to know what we're permitting. So you have to go through a robust engineering and design process and a regulatory process to ultimately inform the decision of the federal government as to whether or not they're going to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down of this project. That cost, while high, I will admit, is not inconsistent with how we are having to do with other projects across coastal Louisiana. When we're talking about levees or pump stations or surge barriers or marsh creation projects, we have to spend money to engineer and design those projects to inform the regulatory process. And so I will readily admit that this price tag is hefty. But as I noted throughout my presentation, I believe that these are investments that we have to make for the overall long-term sustainability of Southeast Louisiana.
We have another question. Actually, I got 4 questions, but I'm hoping somebody else will take some. We walk along the levee where your pumps are, right near 7 or 8 miles or less, where we walk a lot on the levee. And those pumps over the last 5 years or so are rarely ever turned on. So what is the situation with the management of the infrastructure that we do have in place?
Well, so depending on which pumps you're referring to, some of those pumps are operated by Plaquemines Parish, and so there's triggers that would be governing their operational regime. I'm not sure which pumps you're specifically referring to.
West Point area, probably about 2 to 3 miles.
So it's the parish siphons is what you, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I thought they were put in by the state, but that's okay.
They may have been put in by the state several years ago, but they are operated and maintained by the parish. So they are operating those structures.
I mean, they would, if they were operating like they should be operating, that would make a dent in what you're trying to do, I would hope.
Well, I think that the capacity of those siphons is escaping me, but once Mid Barataria comes online, those siphons are going to be pretty much rendered useless. I don't think that they'll be necessary to operate some of those smaller, when you're talking about 75,000 CFS of water flowing through the diversion structure. But that will be Plaquemines Parish under President Kirk Lapine that are operating those structures.
Okay. Bill?
Let's go to Mark, and then we'll go. How about to the back of the room?
So, Mark Schlesing, Times speaking. The Lieutenant Governor has made clear that he's an opponent of the diversions for a variety of reasons. Has mentioned publicly fisheries and dolphins
Sure. So, look, I have a great deal of respect for the Lieutenant Governor as a statewide elected official. He's obviously somebody that loves the state of Louisiana very much. But when it comes to this issue, the Lieutenant Governor could not be more wrong more often. Now, I can work with people who are wrong and wrong often. But what frustrates me is the level of absurdity of the statements and claims that the Lieutenant Governor makes. So let's start with the basics when talking about some of the Lieutenant Governor's comments. We know, number one, that the Mississippi River literally built the land we stand on today. We know that every area that is connected to a river today are the only areas that are actively growing land. And we know that our land loss crisis in this state started when the Mississippi River was levied. Those are facts. You cannot argue that. So some of the things that the Lieutenant Governor continues to state is that there's no sediment in the river. I just showed you those pictures, that there's more than enough sediment in that river to do what we needed to do. Look at areas in the Wax Lake Outlet, in the Atchafalaya Basin, Carnarvon, Davis Pond, West Bay. All of those areas are connected to the river. The Atchafalaya Basin and the Wax Lake Outlet have more than enough sediment. They call us all the time, come get this sediment out of here. You're silting up all of these channels. Why do all of our navigation channels continue to silt in? Because of the sediment and silt in that river. The Lieutenant Governor continues to say, well, I don't understand why we won't dredge. All we've done up to this point in the coastal program is dredge and pump sediment. The largest budget allocation in our $50 billion plan goes towards dredging and pumping sediment. Those dredging activities are going to continue. But what happens when you dredge and you pump sediment and do nothing else? That's when that land starts to disappear. And why is that? Because there's nothing to nourish it. There's nothing to sustain it. There's nothing to protect it. And that's the beautiful thing about sediment diversions. The Lieutenant Governor states that we're going to destroy the fishing industry in this state. We had a productive and sustainable fishing industry in this state before the Mississippi River was levied. Are there going to be impacts to the shrimping and oyster industries? Yes. We're not going to destroy them. We're going to hit reset. We're going to push them further out to where they were catching brown shrimp or harvesting oysters and seeing marine mammals swim where they were 30 to 40 years ago. When the diversion is on, the salinity regime in that basin is going to change. When the diversion is off, the salinity regime returns back to what it was. And so working with those seafood industry representatives, the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, we're going to be able to show the oyster industry and the shrimping industry where the salinity regime will be suitable to harvest oysters and catch brown shrimp. Yes, they will be impacted. But if we don't implement the project, our coast in that particular estuary and ecosystem is going to continue to collapse. We shouldn't be catching brown shrimp and oysters where we are today. If we do nothing, we're going to be catching oysters and brown shrimp on the banks of the Mississippi, here in East Baton Rouge Parish. The Lieutenant Governor also continues to make claims that those of us that work at the CPRA have done things under the cover of darkness to seek regulatory reform efforts associated with the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Yes, we were able to get a waiver through Congress. The United States Congress spoke and said that the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Mid Barataria sediment diversion is consistent with the Marine Mammal Protection Act. I'm not being sarcastic when I say this, but someone should tell the Lieutenant Governor how a bill becomes a law. There are committee hearings, there are markups on bills. You yourself, Mr. Schlefstein, wrote several articles on the fact that the state of Louisiana was going through the effort to obtain a waiver for the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We briefed our board. We briefed the advisory commissions, the levee consortium, on all of these efforts. So the insinuation that we do things under the cover of darkness or that Congress pulled a fast one, again, it just doesn't meet the truth test. He compares Mid Barataria sediment diversion to the Bonnie Carey spillway, and this is important. The Bonnie Carey spillway is about 1.5 miles wide. It pumps about 300,000 CFS of fresh water into Lake Pontchartrain. By comparison, the Mid Barataria sediment diversion is about 200 feet wide, the structure itself. So to say by building a sediment diversion that you're going to see all of the negative impacts associated with the Bonnie Carey spillway is false. What happened in 2019 when the Corps operated the Bonnie Carey spillway twice? You had record river levels, you had record rainfall levels, and you had to operate that spillway. So the entire basins, every basin in southeast Louisiana was fresh. So of course there were impacts to oysters and shrimp and dolphins. Mid Barataria sediment diversion has a strict management regime associated with it. It is a controlled structure designed to get sediment, more sediment than fresh water. And finally, as you well know, Mr. Schlefstein, you probably cover us more so than anybody in this room. The state's master plan is a 50-year plan. The Lieutenant Governor repeatedly says we don't need a 50-year plan, we need a 5-year plan. A 5-year plan. I've got 2 kids. You want me to look my kids in the eyes and say, well, you got 5 years, enjoy it while you can? No. We need a 50-year plan that looks at the overall sustainability of coastal Louisiana in the long term. To provide a coast that's sustainable. Not just a one-shot solution that just dredges and pumps sediment and we walk away from it and see how long it lasts. We need a long-term plan that takes into account all of these extreme environmental scenarios, that utilizes the best available science. And so I just respectfully could not disagree with the Lieutenant Governor any more than I do. But my opinion, Mr. Schlefstein, is that my head is down and we are plowing forward. And I will do everything I can to address concerns of those being impacted by this diversion. But this is the right thing to do for the long-term sustainability of South Louisiana. Yes, sir. I didn't.
In a project of this size and scope, is there a point of diminishing returns? Have you modeled that at all?
What do you mean?
Well, we're putting more money and effort into it than we're getting out of it in restoration.
Well, I think if you look at the economic assets that are housed in southeast Louisiana, you're talking about a $200 billion Mississippi River channel that ships 90% of the nation's grain. You're talking about southeast Louisiana that houses 5 of the top 15 largest ports in the country based upon tonnage. You're talking about an area of our coast that has Port Fourchon that services 90% of the nation's oil and gas. You cannot deny the economic assets that exist but within the Barataria Basin, the pipelines that exist, the transportation of oil and gas and natural gas that flow through those basins. So all of those things, the sustainability of all of those economic assets, the businesses, the people, the residents have got to be taken into account. We're not just looking at $2 billion to create habitat for wildlife and fisheries. Sure, that's part of it. But we're looking at the overall sustainability of an area of our coast that literally feeds and fuels large portions of this country. And again, it's our only sustainable way to stay in this battle. And so all of those things are actually analyzed in the draft environmental impact statement and throughout the regulatory process. And so I guarantee you I wouldn't be spending $2 billion on a project if I didn't believe that it was worth it. Yes, sir.
Would it make any sense to provide funding for oyster fishermen to construct new reefs in order to aid coastal restoration?
Well, I think that's some of the things that we're looking at in working with wildlife and fisheries. You saw after the BP oil spill, there was the early restoration dollars to help create new public seed grounds for oysters, oyster farmers to go utilize. There are investments in broadstock reefs. We're actually investing in alternative methods of harvesting oysters. We're actually working, you're going to hear the governor, I might be stealing the governor's thunder here a little bit, but we're actually looking at how you could produce an oyster that can survive in fresh water and working with Louisiana universities around that. But look, all options are on the table at this point in time. And that's the purpose of the draft environmental impact statement. That's the purpose of the regulatory process, to get ideas from the stakeholders, to get ideas for those that are going to be impacted by these projects. The governor has been very clear. He's like, I want the recommendations to be developed from the ground up. We have taken an approach in state government before where we have taken a fully baked plan to the stakeholders and said, okay, stakeholders, here's what you're going to get. And it's going over like a lead balloon. So we took a different approach. We identified a certain amount of money that BP settlement provided, that the federal government and the agencies that oversee these dollars have said this is a satisfactory amount of money. What do you want to see? How do you want to see us use this $300 million to address your concerns? And I think we've gotten some pretty good feedback from the industry. Every single mitigation measure that you see outlined in the draft EIS right now actually came from the seafood industry and the fishery groups that are operating within the Barataria Basin. And that's something that's important to us and something that's important to the governor that you're going to see moving forward.
Do you know why they're checking for radioactivity and Happy Jack?
For radioactivity?
They're testing for radioactive material in Happy Jack?
I'm not aware
15
of
miles
that.
away from...
No, sir. I'll be happy to look into it, but that's certainly news to me. Look, things are always changing in coastal Louisiana, so that might be something that happened since I've been here, but I'm not aware of that, sir. Any other questions? All right. Well,
Question.
Sure.
Cities are having the opposite problem with sedimentation.